Mr. Speaker. Merci, Monsieur le Président. I rise today to speak at second reading of Bill C-92, an act respecting First Nations, Inuit and Métis children, youth and families. Ce projet de loi, c'est très important et je suis fière d'être ici ce soir de parler de ce sujet tellement à jour. There can be no doubt that Canada's child welfare system is broken, most especially when it comes to the issue of Indigenous children, who make up the vast majority of those who are in care or receiving child protection services. In my home province of Alberta, almost 70% of the kids who are part of the child welfare system are First Nations, Métis or Inuit, even though Indigenous children and teens represent only 10% of Alberta's total youth population. The province's troubled track record in the care of these children has been deeply disturbing, especially when it comes to the deaths of children and youth who were supposed to be receiving protective services. Between 1999 and 2013, a total of 741 young clients of Alberta's child welfare system died while in the care or under the watch of the province, and the vast majority of those who died were Aboriginal. That number is shocking for two reasons. First, it represents the snuffing out of 741 young lives that were meant to be in our care. What makes it worse is that successive Alberta governments covered up those deaths for years and years. Between 1999 and 2013, only 56 of those 741 deaths were ever reported or recorded publicly. It took a multi-year investigation and a legal battle by my former newspaper, the Edmonton Journal, to force the government to admit that the total number of fatalities was actually 741. And since then, almost 200 more children in care have lost their lives, an average of 22 deaths a year. Now, some of those deaths, of course, were unpreventable. Some of those children died of natural causes, of everything from childhood leukemia to complications after heart surgery. Others died in what you might call blameless accidents, a car accident, say, where the caregiver was absolutely in no way at fault or responsible. But far too many of Alberta's lost children died because of the negligence or, frankly, the malice of their caregivers, whether those caregivers were foster parents, biological parents, or family members providing guardianship through what is known as kinship care. Alberta is the province whose sad child welfare history I know best, because I spent decades as a reporter covering this very difficult file, working hard with my colleagues to uncover stories that governments wanted to keep hidden. But I fear there is no province in Canada that has a stellar track record when it comes to the protection and care of Aboriginal children. Our status quo is woefully, fatally broken. And for that reason, I am cautiously, very cautiously optimistic about the promise of C-92, which holds forth the promise of a new paradigm for the delivery of child welfare services, one that puts agency back into the hands of Indigenous families and communities. For far too long in this country, Indigenous children have been removed from their homes and their communities and placed into care without overmuch regard for their culture and sense of identity. Once we did it through residential schools. Now we do it through foster care. Now, not everybody would be comfortable with calling the results cultural genocide, but it is surely beyond debate that taking children from their families to be raised in non-native foster homes and group homes has all too often had the effect of depriving children of the chance to grow up with their traditions, their languages, their spirituality, their pride in their roots and their history. About 20 years ago, Alberta began to grant delegated authority to some First Nations to run their own child welfare systems. The experiment had some difficult and sometimes tragic outcomes, especially in the beginning. Some of those delegated child welfare authorities were, to be blunt, set up by government to fail. They were underfunded. They were under-resourced. They didn't have the trained and experienced staff or the practical capacity to deal with their complicated and demanding caseloads. And children died as a result. One of the chronic issues, which 20 years later still persists, is that Ottawa has always funded child welfare services on reserve and not the province. And in Alberta, that creates a significant funding differential. Banned welfare agencies for decades have received less money to do the same frontline work. And worse yet, they have been particularly shorted when it came to funding for preventative services, the front-end social supports that might have allowed struggling parents to retain custody of their children and helped families to thrive healthy and intact. So when I first read C-92, I was hopeful that this new framework, which would give even more direct jurisdiction to First Nations and Métis and Inuit communities to run their own child welfare agencies, would right that balance and give the communities the resources they need and deserve to care for their own. The resources, in fact, which the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal has previously ordered that they have. And hence the very cautious caution of my optimism. When this bill goes to committee, I believe it is essential that the committee make clear that if there is no firm promise of funding, then this new framework will remain just that, an empty frame, a flimsy false front building without walls or floors or ceilings. We can't just promise Indigenous Canadians self-governance of their own child welfare systems without guaranteeing unto them the money and the other resources necessary to do that job. This can't just be a form of words. A framework with an explicit funding commitment attached would be the most, without an explicit funding commitment attached, would be the most irresponsible of false promises. Mais je tiens à signaler une autre préoccupation particulière pour l'étude en comité. Le projet de loi C-92 accorde beaucoup d'importance en principe de l'intérêt de l'enfant concerné. Il va de soi que l'intérêt de l'enfant devrait être le fondement de toute politique de protection de l'enfance et de toute décision relative à la garde ou à la tutelle. But C-92 puts particular emphasis on keeping children within their extended families and within First Nations communities whenever possible. In fact, it validates and privileges one very particular form of family-based foster care, known as kinship care, above all other care models. And yet sometimes, if I may be blunt, sometimes kinship care is not in the best interests of a particular individual child. When it works, it can be a terrific method of care, an ideal way of minimizing disruption and dislocation in the life of a child. We can see that intuitively from our own family experience. But to be frank, I do worry that if we make kinship care the most favored default model of care, we could inadvertently put some children in jeopardy. Kinship care only works if there are proper checks and balances in place, if kinship care providers are properly screened and trained and supported. Too often I have written about cases where children were placed in kinship care because it was cheaper and faster than finding qualified licensed foster parents, be they Indigenous or non-Indigenous, or where the philosophical imperative to keep children with family members, including their parents, at all cost, actually cost the children in question their lives. I've covered cases that ended in truly horrific neglect, abuse, and death because kinship care providers didn't get the appropriate background checks or the necessary resources. And I've covered cases where children placed in kinship care died because social workers didn't follow up or even closed their files and walked away. That's not to say kinship care can't work. If the caregiving family members are properly prepared and get the ongoing support they need, it can indeed be the very best model, a paradigm for care that keeps families united and keeps children in touch with their relatives and their roots. It can reduce social and cultural alienation and give kids a badly needed sense of emotional stability. But real, robust, ongoing support is essential. And thus I would ask the committee members to consider the practical life and sometimes death consequences of defining kinship care as the automatic first best option. Sometimes, because of intergenerational trauma, there is no one in a child's birth family who is able to provide the care that that child desperately needs. And sometimes, a child who has been in care has bonded already with a foster family, and moving that child would deny them the security of remaining with the only adult caregivers they know, remember, or love. Let me be very clear. I would be the last person to say that the model of plucking Indigenous kids from their reserves or Métis settlements or neighbourhoods and putting them into non-Aboriginal foster homes and group homes is a good one. And while I've covered horrific cases of children who died in kinship care or after being returned to their parents, I've covered many cases, too, of children who died at the hands of non-Indigenous foster parents, many of whom were also not adequately screened or trained or supported or monitored. As I've said, the system we have now is fatally defective. We need a new and better model for caring for children at risk and for caring for Indigenous families. Je souscris de tout cœur au fait qu'il faut donner aux collectivités autochtones les droits fondamentaux qu'ils n'auraient jamais dû perdre, à savoir leur droit de diriger leur propre système de protection de l'enfance et de prendre soin de leurs. Ces droits auraient de leur être restitués depuis au moins un siècle. Je suis tout à fait d'accord pour dire qu'il nous faut des cadres et des accords pour qu'une telle autonomie gouvernementale soit possible. Mais assurons-nous que les collectivités autochtones, métis et inuits disposent des ressources dont elles ont besoin pour que leur autonomie gouvernementale fonctionne. Let me lean on the framework metaphor yet again. When you lay down rebar, when you frame a house, you have to start with a solid foundation, and you can't cheap out on your materials. So let's get this framework properly built. Let's ensure that the best interests of children really are put before the jurisdictional squabblings of politicians and government agencies. Let's make sure that we do everything we can to give the next generation the start it needs. And I ask us to do so in the names of Corvette Cryer, Jaylyn Cardinal, Traislyn Starlight, Shalena Arcon, Serenity R., Caleb Merchant, Jay Johnson, and all the hundreds of Indigenous children who have died because the care we and the status quo provided fatally failed them. Thank you.
Senator McCollum, a question?
Simons.
I thank the Senator very much for her question. I'm so glad you asked it because I share many of those concerns. I'm not the sponsor of the bill. I'm speaking to it to raise some of the very concerns that you're raising because this has to work as all the jurisdictions working together, federal, provincial, and the First Nations and other Indigenous agencies. Otherwise, it will just devolve into more jurisdictional squabbling. And I agree with you absolutely. If the funding isn't attached, then it's an empty framework. I can't speak in defense of the bill, but I'm so glad you asked the question because I think it's a question that badly needs to be asked and answered.
Thank you. On debate.